I want to talk about how these new mobility services are challenging existing regulations and about how this disruption gives cities and the people who live in them an opportunity to reassess those regulations. So the current example I want to use is ride-hailing companies. They're also called TNCs, transportation network companies, and sometimes called e-hailing. Examples are Uber and Lyft, Didi, Grab, Careem, and Ola, among a whole bunch of others. These models use a smartphone app and make the transaction seamless. As we know, to the user, taxis and TNCs provide pretty much exactly the same type of service, getting from point A to point B in a car driven by a driver. In most cities, conventional taxi operators have been highly regulated, with each cab essentially being granted a permit to operate that vehicle on the road. In most cities, there is regulatory capture between the city and the taxi industry. Regulations are outdated, obtuse, and serve as a mechanism to protect the industry status quo. In London, for example, there are regulations for hackneys. At that time, a horse and a carriage with, of course, a driver for horse. Those were established in 1636, over 400 years ago. And their licensing system requires that drivers memorize the name and location of every street in London. And this requirement persists today. It takes a person an average of 3 years and multiple tries before a driver will pass this test. And this is a requirement in the age of smartphones and navigation systems. In Paris, the taxi owners managed to restrict the number of licensed taxis to such an extent that it was nearly impossible to find a taxi in 2011, when a competing innovation, self-service electric cars, Autolib, were introduced. In Miami, it's illegal for certain categories of vehicles to pick up passengers without a 15-minute wait between the call and the trip, as a way to segment and protect roving taxis from the limousines that were only on call. In New York, the medallion system, initially introduced to limit the total number of cabs, while also raising a little money for the local authority, became corrupted, and medallion valuations reached as high as $1.5 million, an amount that far outstripped the earning potential of any individual car. And in many emerging economies, government licensing is used to assign rights to specific minibus routes to prevent clashes among them. In cities around the world, the entrance of the TNCs resulted in a huge pushback from the taxi industry. And it's true, ride-hailing services are directly competing with traditional taxicabs. Yet they sought to avoid many of the responsibilities, costs, and regulations imposed on those traditional private taxi companies. By not regulating this new industry, the traditional taxi industry has been decimated. In Europe, after years of argumentation, the consensus seems to be that Uber is just another form of taxi that competes with the conventional cab industry. The European Court of Justice in December of 2017 ruled that Uber is simply a taxi. It found that, quote, to connect by means of a smartphone application and for remuneration, non-professional drivers using their own vehicle with persons who wish to make urban journeys must be considered a service in the field of transport. And yet, cities could have taken a totally different approach. The disruption to city taxi lobbies also presented an opportunity. The cities could have taken a look at existing regulations in light of these new technologies, and what are the city's goals for regulation? So why do cities regulate? What are their social goals and duties? Can we refer back to those shared mobility principles? Cities are responsible for the safe, efficient, and pollution-free flow of people and goods, while also providing affordable, healthy, and integrated mobility of all people. So the lack of fit between new mobility and existing regulation is what happened with Uber, Lyft, and Didi, and when they came of age. And that will happen again. We could make it so that London cab drivers don't have to spend 3 years memorizing every street, but we have to step back and say, what is it that we're regulating? So when I co-founded Zipcar back in 2000 in Boston, Massachusetts, car sharing didn't exist. And the state needed to figure out whether these shared vehicles should get commercial license plates, and then you'd be able to park in loading zones, or residential plates. But Zipcar was a business. Was the company considered a business? If so, in some parts of the city, you could only park there if you were residents. So could these cars, which were served for residents, be parked in those areas? But they were a business. And one city had a fee for each business establishment. Were each of Zipcar's vehicles parked throughout the city considered a business establishment and have to pay such a tax? And then we can look at another example of disruption. If we look at the advent of shared bikes. The first of these companies were run by private companies, yet the city had given them dedicated public space for bike parking stations. Why were they given public space with no charge? And other companies couldn't have public space for free. So while I can appreciate that it's challenging, cities need to rethink and redo how they categorize transportation services so that when innovations arrive, the city doesn't have to make brand new regulations for each and every new thing that comes along. So what are those key determinants for safety and public space allocation? We can think about vehicles with respect to how much do they weigh, how fast are they going, what is their emissions, and what is the space efficiency? How many people are they moving per square meter?